Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. Today, I'm going to have a chat with, it's sort of like going home to my roots, Berkeley, because I'm going to have a visit with somebody who's, well, I don't know whether you got roots there or not, but you certainly were there for a long time. And so we've already spent a little time getting acquainted by just recognizing our mutual interest in the San Francisco Bay Area in California. This man is Mickey Huff, and I hadn't met him till now, but I feel like an old friend already. He is the president or what of Project Censored. What is your official title? President?
Well, I'm
sure.
I'm the president of the nonprofit Media Freedom Foundation, which oversees Project Censored, which is a media watchdog founded in 1976 at Sonoma State University. We are at campuses all across the country now, and I'm also the distinguished director of the Park Center for Independent Media at Ithaca College in upstate New York. As you mentioned, I just spent the last 25 years in and around the San Francisco Bay Area, where I taught history, social science, and journalism, and that's where I got involved in Project Censored. So now I'm doing a lot of that same work here at Ithaca College.
Well, that's really good because I have been aware of Project Censored a long time, and of course of Sonoma as a university. In fact, I applied to teach there at a time when there were 300 applicants for every job in California, every entry-level professorship in California. So I didn't get hired. Anyway,
I remember
in those days. Let's talk about Project Censored mostly, because every year or so, we've broken the habit a little bit, but quite frequently we do put in an article in Peace Magazine, which I edit, about the one or two of the issues that you identify as having been suppressed or ignored that year, a story, an issue that should have been covered, but somehow, well, I don't know whether, I don't use the word censored so much, but you do. And that, I think, is a fair thing to say. I want to have a conversation about censorship. I have to say, I have been a free speech person ever since watching the police car and people being dragged away back in the late 60s. And
free speech movement. Mario Savio, that was all at UC Berkeley.
Yeah, I was right there. So I certainly believe in free speech. And I have to say I've become extremely confused and ambivalent because I don't know what to make of what's going on the social media. I mean, what Musk did to Twitter, not that I was a big Twitter player, but I got kind of nervous about that. And I don't think many people I know are happy about it. And now there's sort of a general discussion about how much, if any, and what kind of regulation these social media need. How do we make sure that what people are reading has any validity or truth, whatever? So give me your take, and maybe you can give me an official position of what your organization says on the subject.
Sure, I'd love to, Meta. Thanks for the opportunity. It's an honor to talk with you. And I'm an historian, by day. I was a professor of history at Diablo Valley College for 25 years. And that my love of history, of course, merges with journalism and the social sciences, often through a social justice lens. And one of the things that's always motivated me is a quest for truth and a respect for facts and a respect for free and open expression and free speech. So individually, I am opposed to censorship in its many guises. And as luck would have it, the organization Project Censored, which was founded in 1976 by Carl Jensen, that was at Sonoma State University. He founded the comms department there. Carl started the project based on an intellectual exercise. He liked to challenge himself and his own beliefs and observations. And he was a guy from the ad industry, and he got interested in the news and media. And he asked this question about how much did the news media in the United States, which had the First Amendment, right, and a very powerful uh, force institutionally, is a free press and how it informs the public. And Carl really respected the First Amendment as well as establishment news organizations, but he also was a critical thinker. And that was coming out of the Nixon years, as you'll remember. I was born in 1970, so I was kind of born into that milieu or maelstrom of that period. And then I went on to study it more later because I was so fascinated by it. I did my graduate work on the 60s and 70s, in particular, Vietnam, Kent State, the counterculture movements, and so forth. But Carl, he asked a very simple question in hindsight, but he said, how is it that Nixon was so easily able to win re-election in 1972 when he had all of these scandals going on? Ellsberg had already leaked the Pentagon Papers. He already lost the Supreme Court case. There were so many things happening, and the independent or the alternative weeklies, as they were called at the time, they were often writing about a lot of the stuff happening in the Nixon administration. And of course, we know from the Kent State protests that the US was illegally involved in Cambodia and was expanding the war and on and on. And so Carl said, I wonder if the establishment press really covered those stories in deep contextual ways. He wondered, what would the outcome of an election be? What if the American public really was informed about the things that mattered most? And that's where he came up with this idea for Project Censored. And he did get flack at the time for using that terminology because people in journalism said, hey, that's not fair. We only have so many column inches and we only have the nightly news, right? We didn't have cable yet, and we didn't have the crazy 24/7 news cycle where they seem to fill it with what he called junk food news. We can get to that later. But Carl's question, I think, is important because 50 years later, it's still a completely valid question that I think you formulated even moments ago. Whom do we trust? What kind of regulations or guardrails do we need for our democratic republic to safeguard accuracy and veracity of information? The major legacy outlets, established outlets, what we call corporate media and commercial media, have extraordinary resources, but it's been well documented, not just from Project Censored, but from many other watchdogs and many other groups, even including from people inside the news media industry as a private for-profit business, which leads to some of its challenging problems and ethical dilemmas. But, the corporate media today don't really tell the public what they need to know. They don't really report on all of the facts and all of the key matters of our day. And as you mentioned earlier, Meta, you mentioned social media or anti-social media, we might call it. Social media, they aren't journalistic platforms. And we see this whole moral panic of fake news of the last decade, right? In a post-truth world, or what Stephen Colbert referred to 20 years ago as truthiness, our addiction in America to confirmation bias. And if the information sounds and feels right to us, by golly, we're gonna go with our gut. Facts be damned. Well, look, Carl was calling that out 50 years ago. And Carl was saying that we deserved better. And so, not as a means of tearing down the Fourth Estate, but as a means of watchdogging it and maybe even adding to the integrity of it, Carl formed Project Censored, which he created a class where he wanted to teach students the importance of broadening their media habits and looking outside of CBS or ABC or NBC or even the new PBS, right? Because that came out of the Great Society program, the beginnings of PBS and NPR. And of course, community media through radio started with Pacifica in 1949, the flagship station in Berkeley, California, KPFA, where I still have my radio program, the Project Censored Show, founded with Peter Phillips 15 years ago. Still do that with Eleanor Goldfield, where we brought Project Censored to the people's airwaves, right?
And I
Um,
certainly used to watch it or listen to it every faithfully, you know.
yeah, KPFA is still around doing amazing programming 75 years later. And it's still to this day, in a lot of ways, the tagline for Project Censor that Carl Jensen came up with was the news that doesn't make the news and why.
Mhm.
Um, and so it was kind of a critique. This was even before Ben Bigdikian wrote Media Monopoly about the dangers of conglomerate and corporate ownership and privatization of the press. It's before Ed Herman and Noam Chomsky wrote Manufacturing Consent about the propaganda model. But those scholarly books, and add to that Neil Postman in 1985, Amusing Ourselves to Death, those all came after Project Censored was founded, but in the social sciences and in communication, they really bolstered academically and intellectually the reasoning and rationale behind why Carl created the project in the first place. It wasn't because corporate media was a big conspiracy to lie to everyone. It was as a watchdog to show how powerful ownership and corporate pressures for profit were on the Fourth Estate, and that the press was too serious and too important to us. It's the life's blood of our democratic republic. It was too serious to allow it to be sullied for its own interests. And so Carl meant Project Censored to be a constructive critique of what the media left out, but he was also being provocative, right? By saying Project Censored talks about the news that the legacy media won't cover, he ended up making some enemies in the establishment press. But he also had people in the press that knew what he was doing. And so he tried to attract judges of stories that were people from inside the press, from across the ideological spectrum. And, Walter Cronkite, the great Walter Cronkite, was a supporter of Project Censored because he understood that what Carl was saying wasn't that the news media was bad, it was just too important to leave it to its own commercial pressures, right? You know who else was a fan of Project Censored was none other than I.F. Izzy Stone from I.F. Stone's Weekly. And I'm at Ithaca College now running the Park Center for Independent Media, which gives out the Izzy Awards every year. This is the 17th year that we honor the legacy of the great muckraker I.F. Stone. And interestingly enough, I also direct Project Censored, where Izzy Stone was a supporter.
Mhm.
So Izzy Stone, in fact, said about Project Censored, that's how far back the project goes. Um, he said, one of the most significant media research projects in the country. Walter Cronkite said of Project Censored that it was one of the organizations we should listen to be assured that our newspapers and our broadcasting outlets are practicing thorough and ethical journalism.
Well,
And
now,
here I am,
when
9 years
it was
later.
founded, was there
Mhm.
anything comparable, or was Project Censored the first of its kind, the first organization to make it their business or your business?
We were the first sort of academic independent enterprise that later became a nonprofit to make its business critiquing the news, but very strongly influenced, of course, by the reporting of people like Izzy Stone. You go back further to George Seldes, the series In Fact that came out of the 40s was one of the first nationally known media criticism publications. We had media critics going back. And of course, if you go back, and Carl wrote a fantastic book that I still use in my media classes and history classes called Stories That Changed America, Muckrakers of the 20th Century. And he actually goes back even further to Ida Tarbell, and he goes back to Lincoln Steffens and Upton Sinclair. And so these are all the influences of what later became Project Censored. That we believed that there were independent journalists and people writing about things in the public interest that the major newspapers either ignored because they had conflicts of interest, or maybe they just weren't aware of them because they were writing about other things, right? But Project Censored is, to my knowledge, the longest consecutively or contiguously existing media watchdog nonprofit in the United States. Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, which was founded by Jeff Cohen, and they publish Extra Magazine, fair.org, probably one of the most significant media watchdog organizations, I think, in the United States. They were founded 10 years after Project Censored. So FAIR, of course, was also influenced by that. And full disclosure, Jeff Cohen is the person who founded the Park Center for Independent Media, where I now direct at Ithaca College. So it's a small world, Meta, right? It's a media criticism in the public interest is it's a very important pillar, I think, of the Fourth Estate. But it's also kind of a small orbit. It's a small world. There's a small number of people that really are interested in watchdogging the media and trying to hold it accountable in the public interest. And Peter Phillips, who was the second director of Project Censored from the 90s up until 2010, and I've been running it with Andy Lee Roth since then, has more of a sociological and historical perspective. But we continue to basically do the same things Carl and Peter have done, where we look at the vibrant, independent, alternative media ecosystem, and we look for stories while teaching the next generation of intrepid journalists and critical thinkers how to think about media. We don't tell people what to think, but we teach critical media literacy, where we teach people critical media skills, critical thinking skills, how to construct logical, rational arguments. We teach them how to fact check the veracity of information. And then we let the chips fall where they may, right? And so students come to us with the stories that they look at. Back in the day, they were literally looking at hard copies of magazines, right? Like Ramparts from the 60s, right? And the 70s. And then, of course, Covert Action, right? Coming the 80s, the 90s, all the way up to today, to hard copies like this, The Progressive, which was founded in 1909, right? By Fighting Bob La Follette, right? The Republican progressive member of Congress. So there is a tradition in independent media that not only looks to inform the public in meaningful ways to lead or spur informed civic engagement, but it's also a watchdog to hold the press accountable. The establishment press, as we've mentioned earlier, has an extraordinary privilege protected by the First Amendment, that they have the right to report without government interference. But what Project Censored has focused on for so long is the more insidious and pernicious problem is that we have commercial or censorship by proxy. We have corporate media censorship, right? The government does sometimes meddle in information, as we know with WikiLeaks, and censor information. We know that our government has a history of doing that. But the more everyday kind of censorship that Carl was talking about was masquerading as news judgment, right? It was news editors saying, well, that's just not important, or we don't have time to cover that. And so that led people like Carl Jensen to say, okay, that's fair. So in 1982 and 83, Carl did an interview with none other than Penthouse Magazine, because you might remember that in the Reagan years, there was this Edwin Meese and others were railing against pornography. And so one of the things that some of these magazines did to cover themselves was they did a lot of First Amendment stuff. So Playboy and Penthouse and these magazines, which were drawing a lot of ire from feminist movements and the women's movement and others from the left, not just religious figures from the right, these figures staked this claim that they would argue on the basis of the First Amendment that they had a right to essentially peddle smut, but they also focused on the importance of arguing controversies around the First Amendment. And that may seem ironic to some people. And there's a lot of harm that can come to people through things like pornography and so on. So I'm not playing light with that, and I'm not being coy. But it's also that many publications were afraid to talk about censorship in the Reagan years. because of what happened during the Nixon years. And we saw what happened, and we learned how involved our government was from the Frank Church Committee hearings in the Senate and the Pike Committee in the House. We learned that our government was involved in lies and deception around Vietnam, around Watergate. And we learned that the FBI infiltrated the civil rights movement and COINTELPRO, right? And in many ways, the press were fearful maybe to expose some of the corruption and some of the things were happening, and that included criticism of themselves and their own profession. And this is why Carl took wherever he could, he went and took the platform where Carl would say, "Listen, I may not support everything that this publication does, but it's one of the only places that's giving me a microphone or a platform to talk about censorship." And Carl believed that news media censorship was harmful to the public, to the body politic.
He's saying now the same thing about things like Twitter. I mean, we have this whole kerfuffle going on about
Yes.
Musk's taking control of Twitter and making it into much of more of a right wing vehicle. Now,
Yeah.
would anybody from those days who were preoccupied with censorship go so far as to say, let everybody say anything they want without any way of informing people that a certain story involves untruths?
Yeah, that's a really great frame and a lens to look at these things. At Project Censored, we oppose censorship in its many guises. We oppose censorship by proxy. We oppose fear in favor of the commercial news media that either promotes certain half-truth stories to benefit sponsors and owners or suppresses stories out of fear of offending owners or advertisers or shareholders. This era, and when we're talking about the social media era of digital media, we've gone down to the microcosmic level where everybody can have their 280 characters of fame, right? Warhol's 15 minutes of fame. Anybody can write almost anything, it seems like, and not be held accountable for it, right? Going back to 1710, it was Jonathan Swift that once wrote that falsehoods fly and the truth comes limping after it. Right? That going all the way back to 1710. In the era of digital media, we can just type away as keyboard warriors and hit send, and it's halfway around the world, our fake news or maybe our harmful
Yeah, but
information.
there are institutions where people are being paid to sit at a computer and make up lies all day long as
Yeah.
a disinformation project that is
Yes.
deliberately meant to deceive and warp public opinion. Now, what do
Absolutely.
you do about that as somebody committed to opposing censorship?
So that's an absolutely brilliant question. And I've co authored a couple of books about it. One is called Let's Agree to Disagree, that's right here.
I love
It's
that
a critical
title.
thinking guide. It's a critical thinking guide to communication, conflict management, and critical media literacy.
Mhm.
We strongly believe that the antidote to moral panics around fake news, misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, misinformation is information that is mistakenly reported or passed along, right? We all make mistakes. That's why credible news outlets fact check and retract stories and issue corrections. That builds public trust, right? Disinformation is information that's more like black propaganda. It's intentionally deceitful, therefore harmful, right? And so we need to differentiate because everybody can make a mistake, and if we fix mistakes, that's how we learn. But disinformation is more insidious. So knowingly reporting half truths or false information goes against the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics. It's not an acceptable practice in the fourth estate. But propagandists regularly practice those kinds of disinformation tactics. Malinformation is, I'd say, even more duplicitous because it's often partially true Or as Jacques Ellul, the great propaganda scholar from France, said with Nancy Snow quoting him, the propaganda scholar, the best propaganda isn't the big lie, it's the truth minus context. It's a partially factual statement that doesn't give you enough information as a reader or as an audience to ask questions, and you kind of take it in and you run with it because it, well, now we're back to post-truth and truthiness, and it sounds true, it feels true, it's reported a few other places, by golly, it is true. However, it is only partially true. It doesn't include other perspectives or historical context that may lead a reasonable person to ask different questions and come to different conclusions. And so this is where critical media literacy comes in, which is better than outsourcing critical thinking as a third party fact checker. And we've long written about this, including in another book I did with Nolan Higdon called United States of Distraction, Media Manipulation in Post-Truth America and What We Can Do About It, from City Lights out in San Francisco,
Mhm.
where we talk about ways to decode and detect propaganda and so-called fake news. We talk about ways that people can be better informed and ask the right kinds of questions to investigate more accurate news sources. And even in our new Project Censored book, State of the Free Press 2025, we have a chapter in the end of the book by media scholar Bill Usman from Sacred Heart University called 11 Theses on Disinformation, with apologies to Karl Marx, because it's riffing on Marx's 11 Theses. But Usman talks about 11 ways that we can be better girded against whatever these efforts are coming, like you said, whether it's coming from X or social media campaigns or foreign media operators, right? You mentioned there are entities, governments, and other sub-government entities around the world that their whole purpose is to sow division through deception, right? We know this. And it's not just Russia, right? And a lot has been made about Russia and Russiagate that is blown up and exaggerated, which is not a great idea. It's not that Russia doesn't engage in it, it's how effectively have they engaged in it and to what effect. But what we're now partially seeing at USAID, Project Censor's been writing about this for years. The United States has engaged in ritually propagandizing the rest of the world for decades. We've done it through before the CIA, we did it through the Office of Strategic Services and the United States Information Agency. And then later we did it through the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, and the FBI. We then did it through USAID, where we've propped up all kinds of supposed independent news outlets all over the world that are just factories and mills for propaganda and malinformation, except they're being published to benefit NATO and benefit the United States and benefit Western countries and further their propaganda campaigns in third world countries. And what Musk and Doge are doing right now is arguably illegal, and it's very selective and problematic, and they are using it, they are weaponizing it to try to show a certain kind of government waste or fraud that's based on their ideological interpretation that the government shouldn't do whatever it is they don't like. But they're playing a dangerous game because they're weaponizing it for Trump's own ideological agendas. They're also exposing certain things that the public doesn't know about. And many people in the public don't know about USAID or what they were doing. And some of what they were doing, and I know I'll get criticized for this, but some of what they were doing in other countries was actually helpful. Some of the things that they were doing may have been beneficial to some people in other parts of the world, despite the fact that ideologically we could argue, what right does the United States have to meddle in these other countries? Back to our media problem and our disinformation problem. It's very hypocritical for the United States to talk about other countries meddling in our affairs when we've been doing it as a matter of our own foreign policy since at least the beginnings of the Cold War. We've meddled in a minimum of 80 countries' other elections, including Russia in 1995 with Clinton and Yeltsin. So again, This is when we talk about the effectiveness of things like malinformation, where it's partially true. When we cart in the rest of this history and the rest of this perspective, the late great playwright Gore Vidal once talked about the United States of amnesia, right? All these things that we maybe don't remember. But I'd like to do him one further, one better, maybe even riffing on H.L. Mencken. Um, it's difficult to remember things that we didn't know in the first place. It's not just our media that has been corrupted and is an organ of propaganda. Our education system hasn't taught people. We've been teaching people half histories for decades. Many people in the United States don't know the actual origins of the Cold War. They don't know the origins of the CIA. They don't know how the CIA worked with media outlets until the Church Committee hearings, until Carl Bernstein of Woodward and Bernstein from the Washington Post wrote in Rolling Stone in 1977 that there were 400 people working within the United States news media industry that were assets of the Central Intelligence Agency. It was Bernstein that broke that story a year after Project Censored was founded. This is why we stand, I believe, fairly firmly on the definition that censorship happens in the United States. It's a regular feature of our information system. It's a feature, it's not a bug, it's a feature. And that we have been manipulating information to benefit powerful interests in the country since we've had the beginnings of a press.
Let me interrupt there because I'm an editor. I edit a magazine, Peace Magazine, and I edit and produce this series of forums of conversations. And I'm the one who finally who decides whether I want to print a submission or not.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm not sure when I'm censoring. People might say, you didn't publish my article because you don't like my point of view. Well, okay. Sometimes I don't publish something because it's not too well argued or not it's really crackpot.
That's different, though. See, that's different.
Well,
that
how different? That's the problem. Empirically or experientially, um, I don't often come up to the moral question of whether or not I should publish something. But we did have, for example, I have an editorial group, and we did have a dispute about a few months ago about whether to publish an article that was arguing that oh, I don't know. It was a tortured argument that colonizers in Africa have turned people against gay relationships when Africans were already open to it, and this was to be a big story, kind of an expose of, I don't know, something that is already over, colonization. But I didn't like the article, and I didn't think it was important. And some of my people thought it was otherwise. So here we have a question: was I censoring or not? This is what I want you to give me a handy little metric, some little device that I can wave in the air and say, this smells like censorship. No, it's got a rating of 0.64, so it's doesn't quite hit the level of censorship, but it is, it's legit.
I hear you, Meta. You're asking an age-old question, right? There is no truth.com, and if there were, I wouldn't believe it. There are ways that we can ask questions about the veracity of information, but you're now asking the same thing Carl asked 50 years ago. Is it news judgment to not include something, or are there other factors suppressing otherwise accurate reporting? If accuracy is in question and the veracity of information is in question, then news judgment becomes not a cover, but an argument, right? It becomes an argument for what you want to put your name on and put yourself behind because you're not sure if something has been proven or if something is factually accurate or based on evidence, right? We have to ask ourselves,
In this
go
case, it
ahead.
would be how important a phenomenon was this? Did these colonizers go around, doing draconian things to gay people? I mean, is this a
Mhm.
big story that the world has missed?
Well, in
If
some
I thought
countries,
that,
it is.
if I thought that they
We've
had
covered it.
revealed something that we should have known, then I think I would have gone with it. But at the time, I thought,
Well,
I don't think,
well,
you know, I don't think so.
we've covered that. That's actually been a top censored story in our books. We
Okay.
have covered homophobia, and we have covered violence against LGBTQIA plus people in foreign countries in the global south, um, because in some cases Western aid may have inadvertently been going to further some of those interests. And we write mostly about US policy, and we write about the US media at Project Censored mostly. But when it does spill over into other countries, we do look at them, and I don't know the exact story that you all were considering publishing, but if you go to projectcensored.org, you can look at all the stories we've covered going back to 1976. That's over 1,000 stories. That's more than 1,000 stories. 25 a year. We review hundreds a year with students across the country. We're now on a couple dozen campuses. I'm doing the research here at Ithaca College, among many, many other places, and students research these stories. But you can go to the website and see the kind of things that we've covered, the kind of things that we've done. And behind each of them, I think it's important to bring up these questions that you're bringing up right now. We ask ourselves, is the content we're looking at journalism? Does it adhere to the journalistic code of ethics? Who's the publisher of the content? Who's the author of the content? Do I understand the content? Do I have a clear historical understanding of what the person's writing about to even make a judgment? That sounds a little bit like you were thinking that about this particular story that you were looking at. You're like, is this something we need to know about? Is this happening? Is this something that people do we have a responsibility to report this? Has this been reported before? Those are all very legitimate questions. Is there evidence supporting what the article is saying? And then, of course, what's missing? And that's a huge question. The problem is we don't always know what's missing, right? And censorship often lives in these nebulous shadows.
Mhm.
It's the thing, is it intentionally missing, right? That's when we get into mis and dis and malinformation. I can make a mistake as a reporter. And if I learn that I'm missing context or missing a part of the story, I hope that I can have an opportunity to correct the record. If
Mhm.
I'm a propagandist, I'm not interested in correcting the record. I'm interested in getting as many people to believe my narrative as possible. And I think that that very clearly separates journalists from people who are otherwise propagandists. And I'm not pretending that each doesn't peddle in each other's worlds because there's a very blurry line there.
Now we have to move past real journalism back into the social media platforms and the disinformation,
Yeah,
or, or actually, I think what is now being considered as problematic is that we live in bubbles. That the people, if I'm on Facebook, my friends are all people who agree with me, and I
mm-hmm.
don't run into these right wing people. In fact, I live in Canada, and I've ever so far in person or even in a taxi, I've only met two people in my life who like Donald Trump. Well, hell, I mean, he won in the U.S. real fair and square. So I'm
Yeah,
obviously not making contact with people who think the way it does. So I don't understand them very well. Now,
well,
I should force myself to subscribe to things on Substack or on Facebook that are.
I do that as a matter of it's deliberate. I've lived in places where I've had people that I'm not a Republican or a Democrat, but I have lived in Northern California or outside of Sacramento, where many people in the neighborhood were Trump supporters. You get about 10 miles out of Ithaca, and there's a lot of a lot of Trump supporters in upstate around the more rural areas of New York and Pennsylvania. Um, and I think that, I wrote two books about this. Let's Agree to Disagree was a follow up to United States of Distraction when we talked about how did we become so divided and distracted. Well, it's by design. And social media is algorithmically based on confirmation bias to feed you more of what it thinks you already want, which means it's going to preclude you from accidentally running into people that may have very different viewpoints from you, and which means that you are less well equipped to carry on dialogue with people in a constructive way when you run into them because according to the bubble that we're in, we don't where are these people? But as you just said, my goodness, there's got to be 80 million of them here somewhere. They're around here somewhere. And we do a great disservice to ourselves by not talking with and listening to these people, as difficult as it might be for some of us. And I'm not saying to be a doormat. I'm not saying that we want to go down Popper's paradox here, where we're tolerant of intolerance. I'm not saying we should open the door for Nazis to come to dinner.
Hold on. You just said something that makes my ears flap. What is Popper's paradise?
So Karl Popper wrote about this.
Wait a minute. I'm a student of Karl Popper's. I used to go talk to him in his office after hours.
Well, Popper's paradox.
Okay.
Go ahead, please.
No, because if you're going to talk about Karl Popper, I want to hear the story because
I'm only talking about the what's called the tolerance paradox, where among people who are liberal, who find themselves to hold tolerance as something that's important for free speech and free expression, the argument goes that if tolerant people are tolerant of intolerant people, intolerant people may eventually gain power over tolerant people so that tolerance will no longer be tolerated. So it's a cycle.
Certainly was not invented by Karl Popper. I went to Berkeley for the first time in 1949, which was the year of the oath. So my first weeks in Berkeley were spent joining movement activities, trying to make the argument whether or not the oath was something that was a reasonable requirement of university professors, that they must promise, to be loyal to the U.S. Now, so this is not a new argument. Go ahead.
No, and it is not. And that's right on the heels of the McCarthy era and the second Red Scare, when Nixon was vice president under Eisenhower, as you know, and the Hollywood blacklist and all of that. When I became a professor in California, I was first hired to teach in California in the year 2000. So 50 years later, I had to take a loyalty oath or they would not hire me, as an artifact from the Cold War. And I remember bringing it up to the HR person. As an historian, I said, "Are you kidding me? You're asking me to take an archaic loyalty oath from the Red Scare to teach at this school?" And she looked at me and just said, "I don't make the rules. If you don't sign the oath, you can't work here." And that was 25 years ago. So anyway, back to, this idea of tolerance and intolerance. I'm not suggesting.
Just a minute. Is it still the law?
Yeah, to my knowledge. I'll have to ask somebody that recently was hired. I haven't been hired. I didn't take one here. But this goes back, a ways that I had to sign it. I had to sign a paper that I pledged allegiance and loyalty to the Constitution of California and the United States. And I said, well, look, I'm a historian and I teach politics. Of course, I'm going to teach these things. I think that they're important documents. I don't like the language of an oath or loyalty. I mean, that doesn't sound good to me. But, in principle, I did want to work and I did want to teach people about these things. But yeah, those were still things when I was in California. But the thing that we wrote about this issue of tolerance is I'm not suggesting that we roll over and allow bigotry to carry the day. But what I am suggesting, back to this issue of filter bubbles or silos, what social media does is it further restricts the people we interact with. It makes different people harder to come by in our online world, which is why it's really important to one of the things we advocate in terms of media literacy is to get off of your devices and instead of having screen time, have face-to-face time, not even over Zoom or whatever, but I mean literally go down to your local coffee shop and look at a human being and have a conversation. Get out of your house or your apartment and talk to your neighbor. I mean, look, this sounds old school for in some ways, but and sociologists have long written about this. The one classic book about bowling in America,
Mhm.
which isn't about bowling. It was commonplace in the 1950s for Americans to belong to social clubs
Mhm.
or to be part of political parties or activities, even in the counterculture, right? It was commonplace that people congregated and they met and that there was power in movements because people they were real. They weren't astroturf. They weren't just digitized in the ether somewhere. They were real things. And I think that part of reclaiming some of that integrity, not just in our news and information dissemination, but the integrity of our civic engagement and how we act, can't just be done from behind a keyboard or on a phone.
I don't want to disagree with you, but I really do. I really do.
That's fine.
I am 93 and I have arthritis, so I don't go out of my apartment. I only go to the doctor or the dentist, and that's once a year or something. So
Mm-hmm.
I do not go to my local grocery store or whatever. I do not even carry my garbage to the chute. I need help. Now,
Fair, that's fair enough.
had, I have now the most wonderful social life and intellectual life of my entire career because I hold Zoom conversations in which I interview and create panels with people like you all over the world. I mean, they're usually in Europe or they're some of them yesterday was in Australia, but
Mhm.
they're all over the world and they are the top leading people, experts on their area. So I have
Mhm.
the most wonderful conversations anybody could ever ask for. And I've learned so much. And
I'm sure you have and do.
I have friends that they can't come and help me if I were to fall down, but they absolutely do care about me and know that. And I
I
care
believe
about,
every word of it.
yeah.
I
So
believe every word of it.
people say, oh, get off your screen, go out and see real people. I
Mhm.
get as much pleasure from everything I can do with a real person I can do by Zoom except hug them. I can't hug
So
them. But
allow me allow me to agree with you completely for all the reasons you just said, and allow me also to suggest that the technology itself is not the problem. It's how people use it or are used by it, where they're not aware that social media platforms are data harvesters and they are surveillance machines. You are making a very conscious decision to use the technology at your disposal to maximize the intellectual and social benefits that come from communication technology.
Mhm.
You, Meta, are a very unique person.
Really?
Most young people are not sitting in their houses or apartments setting up international conversations with people about what's happening in Russia and Ukraine. Most young people tethered to their devices and looking at TikTok for 8 hours a day are not talking to experts on public policy in Australia. You see what I'm saying? The fact that you have the ability to do that comes from a desire, it comes from an intellect, it comes from experience and education that has moved you as a person to want to be engaged in as many ways as possible. And what I'm suggesting is that, yes, that is extraordinary. You and I wouldn't be talking right now if it weren't for those technologies.
Right. But
But
now
what
look
I'm
here.
saying is, I teach a lot of young people who use these devices, and I will tell you, they are unaware in many cases that they're being surveilled or tracked. They are unaware of how much information and privacy they have already shared and given away. And they are unaware of how to test the veracity of information that comes at them from their boxes because our education has not kept up with the technology. And they may be unaware the degree to which that they are not informed about particular things because of algorithmic censorship and because of the way in which social media platforms center confirmation bias.
Okay, well, look, you're advising people they should turn off their cell phones and their screens and go out and see real people. Okay, if you're going to advise people, the question is what should you advise them to do? Both of us agree that we ought to broaden our horizons and talk to people that we might not otherwise accidentally by choice run into in our social group life, that our friends might not like the people that we talk to, but we should go out and talk to people that we sort of have our doubts about. But even there, I want to encourage people, yeah, keep on your screen, but just go to
Yes.
a webinar or join this discussion. Go to Substack and look for people whose
Yeah.
articles are different from what you normally do. Broaden your horizons, but not by turning off your screen, but by using it. Using it.
Yeah, but it's important for people who have screen addiction to turn them off so that they understand that when the screens are on, they are using them in deliberate ways to seek out different kinds of information that is not confirmation biased sourced, and that they can use the tool rather than let the tool use them. There's a difference, and I teach both. I'm not a protectionist. I'm not an either or guy. I'm both and. But I'm telling you that I'm teaching a generation of people that Stanford University referred to as digital natives. They are growing up with these things as part of their everyday habits.
Mhm.
I'm going to go out on a limb here, Meta, and I'm going to imagine that in 1949, when you were at Berkeley talking to Karl Popper, no one needed to tell you to put down any devices and go and talk to people in classes or go to the meeting on campus or go to the meeting with the people there, which you have carried with you into the digital era. You have carried your practices into the digital era. So you use the tools at your disposal to continue your intellectual and social growth.
That's
What
true.
I'm saying is that people born into this fish, into the fishbowl, don't see the water. The boiling frog doesn't know the water is boiling. We need to deliberately tell this generation that this is an incredible tool. So let's learn how to use it. Let's learn how it can use us. And let's balance our time in the digital world with time in our communities. And that doesn't mean that digitally we can't create and bolster communities, but there's gads and gads of social science research in the last decade that is strongly pointing to the fact that we need both kinds of interaction as human beings.
Well, okay, now maybe there's an explanation for something that I do acknowledge is a puzzle to me. I am
Hmm.
delighted and happy to be living the way I am now with this equipment sitting right here at my desk. It's
Yeah.
the richest social life I've ever had, and the richest intellectual life I've ever had. I even, looking back to Berkeley days, it's this
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
so, but uh, I don't understand because I do read reports that the more people spend on their cell phones and interacting digitally, young people in particular seem to be more miserable and have more mental health issues. And I don't understand why that's true, but maybe you can help me understand it.
Well, Meta, I'm not a social psychologist, but we have written about these things. And partly one of the things that we're talking about is digital alienation. We're talking about people that have such an overload of interaction of a certain type that they are neglecting other elements that are part of the human experience. And I'm not suggesting that you are lacking because you're using these tools to connect yourself to so many things and so many people and ideas, but you also have had a rich past and a rich history where you have been nurtured in social relationships and physical relationships. And you go back to a period when being politically active meant something more than just pushing a button on a screen, right? There was more to it than pulling a lever or a screen. There was there was organizing. And by the way, this can be a great tool for organization politically too, as we've seen. So it's
But
not
no, I mean,
either or,
I'm
it's
not. I
both
think. I
and.
think. Sorry, but I think it has its real limit. Is this Tufekci woman, Zainab Tufekci? Is it?
Yes.
Now she was the one describing the Arab Spring and what happened in the
Yeah.
square in Egypt.
Tahrir Square. Yeah, we've written
And
about that
they
as well.
organized everything by cell phone. But the
That's
problem
right.
is you can't continue an organization or you can't build much beyond. You can call people up and say, meet at such and such a square at 9 p.m. and they will do it. But that doesn't get them acquainted with each other the way they would if they were working on a committee for several years and know which ones will do their work on time and which ones will not, and which ones will tell distorted untruths
Which
and
ones are disruptors?
and which ones you can trust. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
But see, I think that as people, as much as we change and as much as the technology we create to distract ourselves and entertain ourselves, I think that there is a real quality to non-digital interfacing. And even the people who are behind it, we've written about this too. And we have a book called The Media and Me, a guide to critical media literacy for young people that talks about responsible use of digital technology. It doesn't say don't use it. It says, here's what's happening when you're using it. By the way, the same people that designed your social media platforms designed the gambling machines in Las Vegas. It's the same technology. It's the same dopamine hit button. It's the same thing that doesn't want you to get off the platform. So people like Laurent Janier, who wrote Jaron Lanier, who was one of the pioneers of the internet. People like Tiffany Schlein, who's written about what she calls a digital Shabbat, for the Jewish community. She talks about the importance of taking a day off or taking a media fast where you can reconnect with other elements of society and your life devoid of the medium of digital devices and technology as a way of being a more balanced human being. So I think that that's a prescription that we're being confronted with, and I'm Gen X. I was born in 1970. I went through college without computers. I was card catalog. I had an electric typewriter. I did my master's thesis on a processor, no internet. I got my graduate degree in the mid 90s. But by 2000, everything changed.
Yeah.
everything. People started to do cell phones, internet, more and more things were on computer. 2005 and 8, social media came around. So I'm one of those people that has a physical calendar, a digital calendar, notebooks. I have pens, I have phones, I have laptops, I have physical boards, whiteboards, chalkboards. I'm all over the place. I
Okay,
I'm in all these worlds.
let me try to focus this because we only have a few minutes more.
Sure.
I mean, I've raised this before because I think the political question that we have to deal with now is we have Twitter, we have Facebook, we have YouTube, we have all of these outfits, and they very much affect the kinds of lives we can have, the kinds of social lives, and the kinds of ideas that we're likely to consider or be exposed to. And we there's a debate about how to regulate that, when
Yeah.
to regulate that. Uh, you know, maybe it should even be these things should be regarded not as corporate property, but as um, um, utilities like the electricity or the water that
That's
everybody
right.
should be having access to. But if we do
Yes.
that, then whether or not we do that, we still have to decide how to manage these things. And speaking as a politician, please try to be a politician for the moment. What kind of laws or action would you encourage Congress to take? Okay, I'll give you two examples. One is I had signed up for something to advertise, and it didn't fill out the form right, and I came back and realized I have run up a bill for $13,000, and I
Mm.
had to pay it. Now that's only one thing. The other thing is, other example was I had was broadcasting these forums live on YouTube and also making the recording, which I then edit and put up on YouTube. But when the live one occurred, one time I was Zoom bombed. This was only a few months ago, and they
Yeah.
cut me off in the middle, and they destroyed my channel and cut it off so that I didn't have any access. And I was taking the YouTube things and embedding them in my website. So it not only cut off 650 of my previous shows, but all of them from my own website, which I could not recover. Now, fortunately, somebody at the CBC came and interviewed me about this, and finally, YouTube listened and realized that what they had done was wrong, and they reinstated my channel. But the point is, I had no recourse. As an ordinary citizen, I have nothing to say about it. It's a company; they can do what they want. They can accept or disallow you to use their facilities, and
Yep.
that's the end of the story. Because it's a private business. Okay, tell me how we can manage these outfits so that it's for the public good better than we
They
do.
need to be wrested. We need to wrest from the private sector the control they have over the information ecosystem we used to call the public square. People like Victor Pickard, Free Press, and other organizations have long said we need a vibrant, robust public media, not PBS, NPR. That's like one to 5% funded from government. I mean, it's totally a commercial underwritten enterprise. We need $30 billion to start a true public media infrastructure in the United States. I know one place we can get it. The Doge people are looking to cut money from all over the place. They need to look no further than the Pentagon, which spends 10 times more annually than its next closest rival on so called defense, which we know is actually maintenance of empire. We have places to get the money. We know people want access to accurate information in the public interest. The story you just told, heart-wrenching story about losing that content to Alphabet, who owns Google. who owns YouTube, right? We have written stories about it. We have had our own cases with it. YouTube censored our own Critical Media Literacy Conference of the Americas when we were showcasing Sophia Noble, the scholar who talked about, get this, algorithms of oppression that censor media literacy content and social justice issues. So they got caught censoring our entire conference, but when we went to them to petition, there's no recourse. They said, you don't have any videos on YouTube. And we said, right, because you took them down. And they said, they were never there to take down. And so we went into the chicken and the egg. They refused to cop to the fact that they were there. We sent screenshots. We sent emails from academic email addresses that showed that we clearly were sharing the videos as part of syllabi. And begrudgingly, they finally came back and said, well, we found one of your videos. But these private companies are a tyranny when it comes to controlling public debate and discourse. And we have somehow allowed that to happen in our love affair with technology. We've somehow allowed these private, unaccountable companies, and now people like Musk, to be taking a literal chainsaw to public programs and things that support the public interest. And the only way that we're ever going to be able to gain any traction is by supporting a robust public interest media infrastructure. And we must somehow wrest control from the technological oligarchy that now runs our economy and our government. And that's no small matter. And that's no small accusation. We've been writing about it for years. The latest dispatch up at projectcensored.org right now that I co-authored with Misha Herakoulis is called The Technogarchy Goes to Washington, about the Muskification of Meta and the free speech fact-checking charade. We should not be allowing private for-profit entities to tell us what the truth is. We have fact checkers. They're called journalists. We have fact checkers. They're called citizens. And we need to reclaim that power.
Well, I'm pleased to see your passion, because my notion is that we need to be able to identify what it is that's griping us. And I just checked with Gallup and Pew to find out, if you ask people what they get angry about and that they really, really feel boiling mad about, what was it that the last time they got really, really furious? Well, it's usually about either some kind of injustice like this, or the frustration of being unable to cope with digital and other bureaucratic forms and procedures. And there's no recourse. You have to do it. You have to deal with the tax department. You have to fill out the forms, and you can't do it. So you spend your life savings on hiring an accountant to do it for you, and they're wrong 60% of the time. So
they're inherently undemocratic, right? We've outsourced our democracy to inherently undemocratic institutions for profit.
So we need
the enclosure of the commons, what Sheldon Wallen called inverted totalitarianism.
And, this is a political issue that people have not identified as the political issue that they really need to have political groups fight on. Yeah. Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah. I couldn't agree with you more, Meta. I've had an absolutely wonderful time talking with you, and I can't thank you enough for taking time out of your very busy schedule, talking to so many important people, to bother reaching out to me to talk to me. I really appreciate it.
Exactly. This is perfect. This is just what we need to talk about. So we're
absolutely.
on the same wavelength. It's been fun, and I'm
absolutely
in touch with you. Okay.
Yeah. Please do, Meta. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Take care.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.